Talking tonight about the theory of evolution. Earlier this afternoon, I had a wonderful opportunity to spend time with our young people and to be able to answer various questions in which they had. And of course, some of the questions which they had naturally were questions about the evolution theory which they learned in school, which certainly stands at a huge contradiction to that of the Bible belief that God created not only the heavens and the earth, but also created all things therein, including all living things and mankind. And so tonight we want to look at some things pertaining to evolution, but I want to look at it kind of in a unique perspective. I want to give you at least an overview of it, so that way I can catch those of you who may be a little bit rusty and maybe have not dusted off the biology textbook in a while, but catch up a little bit on what are the main principles and foundational materials that ultimately builds the case for evolution. But what I want to also get to is, being a geologist by profession and also by education, there are certain things as a scientist of which I'm constantly asking questions of. Even things of which maybe I've already come to understand but want to continue to test to make sure those things are as consistent and as accurate as I at least understand them to be. And we need to do that. In fact, we saw even last night when it comes to our Christianity, when it comes to our faith, that is actually encouraged in the Scriptures. So no matter what we look at, as Paul once said, test all things. And so we want to test all things, but when we find, as he goes on to say, when we find that which is good, we need to cling to it and we need to put our faith in it. We also looked last night at a couple of things pertaining to the Big Bang versus the biblical account. We looked at the difference of what faith is according to the secular world and in the dictionaries and things of that nature. And we looked at that faith according to the world, as the world sees it from a non-religious standpoint, is really putting belief in something or conviction in something without really having substantial proof. We went on to look at Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 1 and saw that the Bible actually defines faith differently. It defines faith as being something that ultimately is an understanding of those things we hope in, and it is in fact proof of the things that are unseen. And we went on to look at that evidence is certainly there, and that there's evidence and there's facts that we need to evaluate. Sometimes they're direct evidences and sometimes they're indirect evidences, and you can use the indirect evidence to get to a conclusion as well. Well, tonight we're looking at the theory of evolution, and based on even Merriam-Webster's dictionary and the definition of what a theory is, really a theory is an idea or a hypothesis of which sometimes has no proof. It's just a theoretical idea which proposes a way that things could be, but is not absolutely substantiated. And so we want to look at evolution tonight, the theory of evolution, and I also want to look at it from really, as I get to the end of it, I want to look at it through the eyes of a geologic scientist, as such as I am, and I want to tell you tonight that there is not enough things from a geologic perspective, even though they say there is from the fossil record. I'll tell you tonight, what we'll see tonight is that the fossil record, in fact, creates a huge amount of doubt when it comes to the evolutionary theory. And it, in fact, is to the point that I don't have enough faith to believe in evolution based on the geologic evidence I'll share with you this evening. To begin, let's begin with quickly what is evolution by starting with what is not evolution. Evolution is not simply a matter of change over time. If it's just change over time, it'd be like this illustration of some 60s or 50s, even Volkswagen here, which after time starts to decay. And certainly that's how things work in our world. Things will eventually decay and wear out, even as the Bible suggests. But what evolution is a gradual process in which something is transformed into a different and usually more complex and superior form, such as we even see in the Volkswagen today. It's evolved, and obviously evolved from design and engineering. It has taken intellect. It has taken research. It is taking advancing things to a technical level to make it better. It is evolved, but evolved from the perspective of improvement by engineering. We think, though, of biological evolution as we're introduced to it in magazines and in television and in news and various other formats. It is the process by which different kinds of living organisms are thought to have developed and diversified from earlier forms during the history of the earth. And so, typically we think of Darwinian evolution. We refer to it just simply biological evolution. So there's 5 principles of which evolution is ultimately built upon that we need to think about tonight, because we need to understand them so we can get to the test. We're going tonight to test evolution from the scientific method perspective and determine whether or not, from the geologic evidences of which they use to prove evolution, if it actually substantiates it according to the test we'll establish here this evening. The first thing I want to talk about is two ideas, even though they're very similar in word. It's abiogenesis and biogenesis, meaning genesis meaning being, beginning or creation, bio, life, a without biology or life, genesis, and then one with biology, genesis or life, genesis. First, abiogenesis. Abiogenesis is the original evolution of life or living organisms from inorganic or inanimate substances. We refer to that as spontaneous generation. According to scientists, even though it's hard to see here, in the primordial earth, as it was starting to coalesce and as it began to evolve and ultimately solidify and become the form of which we know it today, this again according to scientists, so don't get confused, it's not according to Brent, but according to their idea is that ultimately you have, in the simplest form, lightning striking a mud puddle, and then life began. And ultimately, they come up with a particular model that is framed after what's called the Miller-Urey experiment from 1953. A professor and a graduate student ultimately wanted to conduct the creation of life in a test tube kind of scenario in the laboratory. And so they actually had to build an apparatus because they couldn't do it just in a test tube, but they had to enclose it in a certain controlled environment in which they ultimately heated water, vaporized it, introduced some other gases and chemicals, and then sparked it, that being the lightning strike, of course, in that primordial atmosphere and condition, and sparked what they believed was the beginnings of life. What's interesting is they had to have water, methane, ammonia, hydrogen, as well as carbon monoxide. And what they did is they sparked it, and it created some basic fundamental organic materials. And they said because those are also found in living organisms, this is the precursor to life. And so evolutionists congratulated themselves. They had succeeded according to their idea. The problem is not all of those things are actually fundamentally of value, at least in the living organism. Some were, and the reason some were is because they already introduced carbon. They introduced carbon through methane, which creates, based on its definition, organic molecules. So they already introduced it. They're the ones that actually created it. But here's the question. How do they know those gases were in the primordial atmosphere? They don't. But they are good chemists, and they know what they need to get to organic molecules. And they also forgot a couple of other basics, which we don't have time to go into today. But ultimately, they engineered something to mimic what they thought was the beginnings of life. So, when they did that, they obviously tried to prove abiogenesis, but even today, with all of the science, with all the advancements, with all the technical capabilities and all that we've learned since 1953, no one's gotten any closer, and there's certainly never been life created in a laboratory. And so, that's a real misnomer, even though it continues to be touted every year on its anniversary as being supposedly the way in which we ultimately came to believe that life could start spontaneously in a primordial ooze here on Earth. Well, when it comes to biogenesis, biogenesis is the part where life then evolves to the next level, or living things evolve to other living things. It is the production of new and different living organisms from other living organisms. We call this evolution of the species. And it's ultimately painted out in this particular illustration. And in this illustration, it is showing ultimately this evolutionary change of single-celled organisms making their way into more complex forms, and ultimately to humans being at the end of the chain today. As we like to summarize, it's from the goo to you by way of the zoo. And so, that's what they propose. And that's what children are hearing, and certainly what they, in fact, sometimes believe. So another principle that is essential to evolution is the idea of random mutations. Random mutations are essential to the evolutionary theory. Random mutations are a sudden departure from the parent type in one or more heritable characteristic caused by a molecular change in a gene or a chromosome. We call this genetic modification. In this particular example, The calico kitty is supposed to have gold eyes. What happened? There was a miscode in the gene that ultimately triggered a blue eye, such as with the Siamese cat. Now, every animal has the capability of having some kind of code change and ultimately resulting in some kind of genetic modification. We all have that ability. That's what makes us different, you see. Slight adjustments in genetic code modification makes the variety that is amongst us and makes us a little bit different than even our parents. Now the question really becomes is this an advantage or advantageous alteration? Meaning, does it give the calico kitty some special ability, superpower, for having the blue eye? Well, no, it's just a blue eye. And so we have genetic mutations and things that we'll talk about here in a few minutes. But the question becomes is, are they hereditary? Can we pass them along generation to generation? And do they really improve the performance of the species? Because if they don't, they're really not necessary and there is no advantage to them at all. Another principle of evolution is natural selection. Natural selection is something that Darwin spent his focus on when he wrote his particular writings. He said, or the definition of natural selection is the process whereby organisms better adapted to their environment genetically tend to survive and produce more offspring. As Darwin spun it, survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest. You need these unique niches in our environments to ultimately force nature, according to the evolutionists, to pick the superior gene or superior type or ability within that species. And then in that unique niche, it departs from the rest of the species, which may actually have some other advantage or some other prospect based on its environment. In this case, typically what is given in the biological textbooks is the case of the peppered moth. The peppered moth, actually, as you can see there, when it's on a dark bark of a tree, you can see that it would be easy to be visible to, for instance, birds who are out hunting for these things as food, and the white moth would be plucked away and it would ultimately be weeded out of that particular niche which it is ultimately alive in or living in. But down at the bottom, and you can barely see it, there's also a dark version of the peppered moth. And as you can see, it's camouflaged. It is barely recognizable. The farther back you are, it's probably non-recognizable. But the point is it has an advantage. Now, let me ask you this question. I had to go look this up myself. How many white barked trees are here in North America alone? And why would it be that the white moth can't just land on a lighter colored bark and then it would have the advantage versus the dark colored moth land on a light colored bark and then it be the one that's ultimately hunted? Well, it turns out there's 1,000 species here in North America alone of light colored white bark trees. And so when you have those kinds of trees, obviously this role reverses. So my question immediately is, it doesn't matter on just one surface. It matters in the whole niche of the environment, and certainly there are light and dark colored things. So this really is a very poor illustration, but it's in most biological textbooks. The key to it is ultimately changing conditions in an environment which ultimately drive this kind of change. So the fourth principle is then what's called transitional forms. This is where evolution really kicks into gear and ultimately drives the idea that speciation has occurred over time. It is the idea that is represented as fossils or organisms that show the intermediate states between an ancestral form and that of its derived descendants. We refer to these as missing links. The example that is often shown in the textbooks is Archaeopteryx. Archaeopteryx is supposedly the link between dinosaurs, which went extinct 65 million years ago, some great extinction event that's still debated today. But supposedly, Archaeopteryx was the link to ultimately the evolution of birds which survived past the great extinction event in 65 million years ago, according to scientists. And so Archaeopteryx is kind of one of those iconic missing links. And of course, there's missing links between apes and humans and things of that nature. We'll talk about that here in just a few minutes. But this one is on display in almost every natural history museum because it is touted as one of the great proofs of missing links because there are so few of them out there today. So then you need geologic time. You need vast amount of time for all this to work. Geologic time just simply represented as a long period of time representing the Earth's geologic history, which is about 4.6 billion years according to current science. One thing I've always told people, just if you don't like the number, just stick around a while. They'll add a few more billion years or million years from time to time because they've got to ultimately increase for every new issue in which they face that they need more time for in the evolutionary process. And so last night we saw the Big Bang said our universe began 13.7 billion years ago. The Earth supposedly came into existence 4.6 billion years ago. And then here's just a representation of the geologic column of just looking at really just the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. And then there's certainly earlier rocks that aren't represented in that column, and certainly certain fossils that are associated with them. We'll look at a deeper dive of this here in just a little bit. So when it comes to these 5 principles, we understand them, and we understand they have to work together in a certain way to achieve the end game, which is the evolutionary process. How life began and how life continued to evolve through time to see all the species that we do in our world today. So what do we need to do? Well, if we're going to believe in evolution or the theory of evolution, we need to put it to the test, because it is indeed a theory, meaning it's hypothesized, it's proposed as something that is potentially true, but is it true? Well, we have to use the scientific method to ultimately test that. So we start with the hypothesis. The hypothesis is that evolution is a process by which life began and continued to evolve such as we see it today. That's obviously, as we said, a contradiction to the creation model, their creation worldview. But then we need to establish some kind of experiment. Then we need to check the results, and then we need to determine what are the conclusions of that particular test. So what I would propose to you is this. Let's look at various things such as random mutations. Let's look at natural selection, and let's see if we do see transitional forms. Tonight, I'm going to give one thing to those who are evolutionists. I'm going to give them a certain amount of credit, because if we're going to give them a certain credit, then we can actually test this. Because one thing we don't have working for us at this point, because we haven't spent any time studying it in this meeting, is we don't know anything about the geologic side of time. So I'm going to give geologic time to the evolutionists and say, I won't question it tonight. I won't even worry about it. We won't even bring it into our test. In fact, we will assume the time in which they propose is actually the actual time. It's factual. We're going to give them that. We have to make certain assumptions when we set up tests. So let's make the assumption that time is correct, and let's determine if the other things actually occur within the time that they allow. And at the end of our test, we'll determine if things really are as they claim to be, or as they promote them within the evolutionary theory. First thing I'll point out, they have never recreated abiogenesis, or starting of life from non-life. The Miller-Urey experiment did not succeed in that, and there's been no experiment since that ever succeeded in that. So right off the bat, one problem occurs, and we're going to even assume and give them the case that they can actually do that. But abiogenesis has never been done, so therefore there actually is no test, or there is no result that even starts this process. But we're going to give them credit there too. So I'm giving a lot of allowance, really. I mean, it's kind of like me playing basketball with one of you little kids, even though I'm going to have a height advantage, and saying, you know what, we'll tie one hand behind my back, and I'm also going to hop on one foot. I'm going to give you an opportunity here, because I know there's a distinct problem and disadvantage here. So we're going to give evolution that kind of opportunity tonight by giving it certain things. We're going to allow abiogenesis, and we're going to allow geologic time, and really it's up to them just to prove anything else. So here we go. The evolution story, as your children are taught in the classroom today, looks something like this. This comes out of a textbook just a couple of years ago. And what it shows is the happy little biology student learning about their heredity through all of these species, going all the way back to a single cell organism. And this is just the Animalia kingdom, just animals. So we're not worrying about fungus, we're not worrying about plants, we're not worrying about all the other stuff. But this is what they're teaching. Turns out, based on this, You know, for you kids, and this is what gets them all excited when the teacher tells them, you know, you're not just related to humans, you're related to all these animals. You know, I'm going to be a little bit honest. I'm kind of bothered that I am related to a flatworm. It just bothers me. Turns out, that means you're also related to a tapeworm. So don't attack family the next time you have one. So, problems with that, and certainly it kind of animalizes humans. We talked about that. We talked about human behavior day today in our question and answers of how when we treat ourselves like humans, and when the evolutionist wins and says, hey, you're just the end of the chain of an animal series, guess what humans tend to be? They tend to act like animals. And that becomes problematic, and even in our society, we see what ultimately results from that. But this is what they're taught. But you know what? This is the simple version. When we look at a spectrum of all species, major species only, we actually see that there are tons of branches on this entire spectrum of all the species in the world today. And again, these are just some of the majors. But what we see is, here's man, Homo sapien. I know it's hard to read, but Homo sapien is all the way over here. And we go all the way back around, and this is a centric circle that is ultimately stepping in years, such as 4 billion years when supposedly life began. That's hypothesized. There's 1 billion years, and you can see life got to a very slow start in the first 3 billion years. And then really, if you go around here on the circle, at 542 million years, you come around to the Cambrian explosion, you can see that, in fact, just in the last 500 million years, most of life on Earth began. That tells me evolution really struggled early on. But since then, has tons of evidence to show that the evolutionary process supposedly occurred. And we'll take a look at that. But what I want to do is I want to start way over here. I want to start with the end, and I want to work back a little bit. I think that will help us in looking at this. What we're looking at is really how primates, as well as humans, are connected according to the textbooks. I want to qualify that again. In the textbooks. And don't get the misunderstanding that I'm trying to promote this, but this is what's being taught in the schools today. What's interesting is it has the chimpanzee right next to the humans, which is next to the gorilla, next to the orangutans, next to the apes, all the way down to the lemurs. It was a beautiful little IMAX series that came out a few years ago called Meet the Lemurs, and it was about these cute little cuddly things. What was the purpose of it? It wasn't to teach you about these cute little cuddly things, it was to teach you about your ancestors. It was evolution in the movie theater trying to teach you about your ancestors and trying to show you the similarities that you have between it, even though you weren't connected to it until 65 million years ago when the dinosaurs left the Earth in the Great Extinction. But what's interesting here is even according to this, which is found in textbooks, it says that 25 million years ago, the last common ancestor of monkeys and apes lived. And then what's interesting too is that it was between 8 and 6 million years ago, of which humans were related to supposedly chimpanzees through a common ancestor, of which it says we do not yet have its remains. What does that mean? We don't have the missing link, but we believe it to be true. Now, we talked about what faith is, right? We talked about that last night, that faith, according to the modern dictionary, is believing in something that has no proof. And it is ultimately pointed back at those who believe in religion, faith-based religion, and it tries to attack that. And guess who promotes it? Evolutionists, atheists. And what do we find here? The atheists don't have proof. The evolutionists don't have proof. So what do they have? Faith. They have faith. And they don't want to admit that, but that's true even according to their own definitions. They have faith. And so, if you're going to believe in the theory of evolution, you're going to have to put faith in it. And tonight, what we're again testing is there enough evidence for you to have faith in evolution? And the reason I'm proposing this is because what usually happens is when people of the faith are challenged in the universities and at high schools, or even in their life through the things they observe in the media or in entertainment or on the internet or whatever the case is, when they struggle in their faith and they're introduced to these things and it rattles their Christian faith, Bible-believing faith, then they're going to make a choice between two faiths.
Amen.
They're going to have to make a choice between a Bible-based faith and a faith in things like evolution. A faith in things like the Big Bang, which they don't know anything about yet either today. Also, they said, as we saw from their own quotes, no proof last night. And so it's a faith-based system. And you're making a choice between two faiths. And so you're going to have to determine which of my two faiths has the greater evidence. And then you're going to have to choose. And unfortunately, sometimes we lose people from the Christian faith because they choose evolution, not knowing some of these basic premises which aren't introduced in the classroom. They're not introduced, and therefore they just make certain assumptions. In fact, sometimes they're delivered as fact without ever hearing about these principal issues. So let's look just at the last two. Let's look at chimpanzees and humans. And let's look at this close-up of all of the supposed cousins and ancestors, we might say. At the very bottom, it says hominin ancestor. That's the one they don't have, but they hypothesize, and therefore we're going to give that to them too. You know, we're just in such a giving mood tonight. We're going to go ahead and assume that's okay also. We're going to give them that. So supposedly there's a hominin ancestor, and then you have all of these different groups of different subspecies. But you have Homo sapien, humans at the top. You have Homo neanderthalensis, I can't even pronounce it right. The Neanderthals, we'll just say it that way. But supposedly they're a failed race or a failed species. But what we have here is really all of the things which have a circle and a cross through aren't even here today. These are all supposedly extinct based on various discoveries and identification of these things. And so all this is built on various discoveries, nothing actually surviving today other than chimps and humans, which we have there at the very top. So here's another illustration that comes out of a textbook and off of a website as well. And in this you actually see representation of these different species just based on skulls. So these are just the skulls of these various species, and what we have here is 6 million years ago up to today, working from the back or top left down to the bottom right. Here's a modern human skull just for a comparison. Now, using your own eyes, making your own observations, we're going to do a little bit of interpretation. And what are we going to interpret? We're going to look at things that look like the human skull, which are all of these of which I circled. Why are they like the human? Because they have ovate eye sockets, because they have a round cranium, they have a narrowed side jaw area and facial bones. They do have an indentation for the ears, which most animals have. And so you see that they look fairly similar. Yes, they're in different conditions based on how old and how eroded they are, but overall, they look to be very much human. Now, how about these three up here at the top right? What do those look like? Well, notice that the eye socket is very enlarged with a really high eyebrow, and it's almost got kind of a widow's peak. And if you're to imagine me with wet hair and pulling my hair back, I can have that look. Kind of tough, I know, I get over it. But you notice the skull is actually unique. It's got that high raised piece of the skull all the way over the top. And you can also see the very much flared cheekbones. And so just observationally, we can see those are very similar. Well, what do we have today that looks like that? Well, here's what's called a pan-troglodyte. I'm going to remove the teeth in the lower jaw because those are usually missing. And what do we got? We got a match. We got the peak, we got the flared cheek area, we have the same upper bridge of the mouth, we have the raised eyebrows. What is a pan-troglodyte? It's a chimpanzee. It's a chimpanzee. So now we have chimpanzees easily identified. We have humans easily identified. And then we got this guy here who's supposedly the link. The link. Now what I'm showing here, everything that's white is the actual fossil or bone that was found. In this case, the bone is actually replaced with calcite. But in this case, the black is the interpretation that goes along with it. Now, how much skull was actually found there of our so-called ancestor? Only the flared cheeks, a couple of teeth, and the nose bridge, upper bridge, mouthpiece area. Now, what's interesting is they admit it must be a raised eyebrow. They smooth off the cranium, but there's the flared cheekbones, and that's the real data. That's the facts of this fossil. And what does it look like? Well, it looks like the pan troglodyte, not the human. So what's happening? You're actually seeing pan troglodytes, you're seeing humans, and then the so-called earliest ancestors at the top left are just bone fragments, not enough to even use to identify anything, but that's supposedly our other links and ancestors. How good is the evidence? It's pitiful. It's pitiful. You can't make an interpretation on that, but yet they will. And they'll use a lot of creativity to get you there. But there isn't strong evidence to tie these things together. And now, you've been informed. Now you know how to identify a pan troglodyte versus a Homo sapien. And so let's play the game offered at the Boston Science Museum, which is the skull game. Teaching you about evolution and giving you some impressionable idea of how you're related to other things and species. It says, can you identify early human skulls and discover what they tell us about human evolution? And so the little kids, they go and they try to match the numbers, they try to build out the timeline and all the connections, and they get all excited about it. They make a game out of it. It's a teaching tool. And it's ultimately impacting the mind of your child without you even realizing it, because you're over here reading something else about something else, and your kid's learning about evolution. So what do we find here? Let's play the game, but not according to their rules. Let's play according to what we've learned. Those are not humans, not the one up there, not the two down below. Why? Because they look like pan troglodytes. They look like chimpanzees. But how about the rest? Well, there's certainly those that look very much human, and there's one that's a little bit questionable with a little bit of a flared out cheek area and a kind of a weird shaped skull attaching to a high eyebrow, so I don't really know what that is. I'll admit that. It's okay to admit when you don't know. We talked about that earlier today. It's better to say I don't know than to give a bad answer and then ultimately come back on it. So we're just going to say I don't know. But we can see the humans and we can see the chimpanzees. And it has nothing to do with which one came first and which one's related to the other and so forth. They're pretty distinct and you can't identify them. And now, you can go to the Natural History Museum and you can play along with all the children and you can point out the error that's going on here as well. Well then when we see in some of these displays various interpretations of what they might have looked like, adding things like muscle, flesh, hair, even some tone or color to them, we get this kind of interpretation that shows all the various early human beings or early hominins, our early ancestors. And so you see this in this interpretation and you think to yourself, wow, that's pretty convincing. Well, what are you finding here? Well, you're finding the interpretation of people who are applying various things to kind of tease your mind into thinking that they are different at times. Well, let me ask you the question. Do we see differences in the human species? Do we see variability? And can we not imagine that if you see head shapes and sizes and various pronounced features such as eyebrows and jaws and cheeks and elongation to the skull, wouldn't we anticipate that the skull's going to be a little bit different too? And it is. It is. This is just modern examples of variability within the species. How variable can it get? Well, how about the canine species? Is there any variability amongst it? Yes, there is. And they are able to interbreed. That's what defines the species. And yet they look very different, don't they? Very different. And if you crossbreed things that are very different within species, guess what? You get something that kind of looks new and different too. And that's just generation to generation. You didn't need millions of years to get there. You just needed one generation to start making the alterations to what it could possibly look like. And so again, what do the humans look like? Do we have variability? Yes. A lot of variability. A lot of variability. And so when you start seeing these interpretations, and you start looking at them based on the variability, and if you were to literally strip them down to the very basic shapes of the skulls and the faces, and not add all of the other, what we call artistic interpretation, then actually there are some close similarities, and there certainly could be similar species being represented by just these that are on the board. But they try to make them so different by color and hair and skin tone and all the other things. And they try to ultimately break that up in your mind because they want to convolute it into believing what they're trying to push on you. They're trying to sell you on evolution. And certainly, in these cases of some of those skulls, they are variable, they are different, but they're still very much human, Homo sapien. So what do we know about genetic mutations? So number one, we know that there's a lot of variability within species. But what do we learn about genetic mutations? Well, genetic mutations can occur. We can have, for instance, more than 5 fingers. We can have 6. If you're a little bit clumsy, you know, maybe a 6th finger is good for you. That's okay. We can take that. How about, count them off, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 toes. Boy, anyone with a stability problem, this might help. Finding shoes, not going to be easy. But that's a genetic mutation. And certainly we see these and they're well documented. How many of you ever said, man, I wish I had an extra hand? How about an extra arm, such as this baby? Literally, a genetic change is still human, but it's altered, isn't it? But notice, out of all of these mutations, it's not like something new grew that's completely foreign to the human body. It's just extra somethings, isn't it? Extra somethings. It's not suddenly like in some of these science fiction movies, you suddenly have all these new adaptable things that come from other animals, like wings or other things. It's something that's still a part of your genetic code. And so when you go and you look at the genetic code that is found in DNA, what happens sometimes is the code gets a little jumbled up. Sometimes there's extra replication of code that ends up saying, build another one of these. And it's a mistake. It's a miscode. And the miscode ultimately results in the extra thing. Or there's missing code, and what do we call that? We call that a mutation. We call that, in fact, in this case, it is genetic miscoding, most often resulting in birth defects, tumors, or cancer cells, leading to death if untreated. They're not positive things. And what we also find is even when they are benign and don't have a negative impact on the human body or whatever the animal could possibly be, in very limited cases, altered genes can be transferable to progeny or children, but that trait is typically recessive. Meaning, yeah, the code might be there, but guess what? You find a mate, it has good code, the good code overrides the bad code, and we're back to normality. It's okay. You don't have to worry about it. You got a 3rd arm, your child may only have 2. They may have wanted the 3rd, but that's just the way it goes. But that's how mutations work. And so the misleading idea of how things are going to suddenly evolve into some new species isn't even supported in what we see from actual cases of genetic mutation today. There have been genetic experiments. And the genetic experiments of which we've seen in the last century, that's all there is, only a century's worth. In the last century, we've seen genetic testing and experimentation that has helped us to understand genetics even more. We find that there was numerous experiments done on what's called Drosophila. And Drosophila is just that of the simple fruit fly. And it is chosen because of its high reproduction cycle, meaning it can go from being produced as an egg to full-grown adult with full reproductive capability in 10 days. That's why if you got some fruit sitting out on your table and it starts to get a little stinky, you're going to have a whole lot of fruit flies. If you don't take care of it, there are going to be a lot more fruit flies. So they mass produce rapidly. And that's important because if we're going to test things and understand genetically how things can be altered through time, such as 35 generations of these things a year, 1,000 generations in 25 years, that's about how long a researcher may spend their life working on a project like this. It's equivalent to 20,000 years of humans to reach that same generation count of 1,000. So it's 800 times faster, and what it means, it's synthesized time. It allows us to look at things in a way that we can look at a species and we can produce it multiple times, and we can try to apply various things to it to ultimately make it change. And through those tests and experimentations, we can see what actually happens, what mutations ultimately do to a species. See if it is advantageous or if it ultimately causes a fatality. But they also produce 100 eggs a day during their reproductive cycle. 100 eggs a day, which ultimately means 2,000 eggs in a lifetime. They live to be about 30 days old. So that means 10 days it's in the cycle reaching maturity. In the last 20 days, it can produce 100 eggs a day. That's your 2,000 eggs. Some simple math tonight. Yes, geologists can do it. You reach maximum population and variability this way. So Drosophila is fantastic for doing genetic testing and genetic engineering. And so what have we learned after all of these years? Well, you can have dark fruit flies, you can have light fruit flies, you can have striped fruit flies, you can have big fruit flies, little fruit flies. You can even have, when it comes to their eye color, variations of eye color. You can have white, you can have red, you can have black, you can even have black and red according to the bottom. So after a century of research, we see all of this variability. Now here's the question. After a century of research, how many new species do we have? How many new species do we have with all the experimentation that tries to force genetic miscoding to result in something new? Because experimenters are ultimately manipulating the genetic code. You can have 4 wings, again, a reproduction of additional appendages that are already in the DNA coding. But here's what it said in June 2004, according to the BBC Online, scientists see new species born. What the article says is whether the 2 closely related fruit fly populations represent one species or 2 is still debated by biologists. We'll give them credit. However, university researchers believe the insects are in the early stages of diverging into separate species. The reason of that is, if you go on and read, is because they're starting to non-reproduce with one another. In fruit flies, there are several examples of mutant genes that prevent different species from breeding, but scientists do not know if they are the cause or just a consequence of speciation, meaning evolution. What I see in all of that is, they debate it, they believe it, and they just don't know about it. That's what it says. What is it? Faith. It's faith. And at the end of all of this research, and after all of these tests, amongst all of these biological students and professors, we still got fruit flies and nothing different. Fruit flies and nothing different. There has been no evidence of evolution in all the experimentation in Drosophila today. So, when we look at the principles of evolution, we see there are random mutations. We saw some cases and examples of that. We also saw that there can be some natural selection. But as far as adding them geologic time, we're going to give to them. The hypothesis is that if we do have random mutations and natural selection, such as we've seen, we give them the geologic time, then they should ultimately reach transitional forms. And if they have transitional forms, and if we give them some more geologic time, they need lots of geologic time, then you ultimately get to biogenesis, meaning you create new species. And if you take biogenesis, new species, speciation, and you add even a lot more geologic time, you can get the theory of evolution to work. You can get the theory of evolution to work. Now, what was the one common denominator in all that? You need a lot of geologic time, don't you? So we're going to give them the geologic time, and let's test and see whether or not all of these things have happened. But let's remember, they never got abiogenesis. That's never been proven So again, they can't even get this thing kick-started, but we're going to give that to them for now. So applying the scientific method, does it work? Let's look at the fossil records to close this evening. And let's ask the question, have species evolved over geologic time? Now, I'm not talking about taking the interpretation of all the fossils that are out there and trying to connect the dots between all the species and how they're related and ultimately build out the evolutionary tree or the family tree. I'm talking about, let's pick some species, let's look at them, let's go back into time, and let's see how much they've changed. Because with enough geologic time, evolution has had plenty of time to get the job done. And the more time, the less excuse the evolutionist has as far as why it never evolved over that much time. Let me remind you what the geologic column looks like. The geologic column here represents all of time for Earth all the way back to some 4.5 billion years ago. Life began supposedly at 4 billion years ago. And then there was some, remember, it started out slowly, but then you get to what is called the Cambrian explosion, and then all of the Phanerozoic, which includes these ages here. We'll get into some examples of what those represent here in a minute. But there's the rest of geologic time for which most living organisms occurred, in which we have all of our fossil record to date. So there's some iconic extinct fossils. And that will give us an idea of where we're at on the time chart to kind of help us simplify geologic time. We live in the Cenozoic, and in fact, we appeared right here on the tick mark. We're so new, we don't even get a spot. But that's where we are. Then we go back in time, and we go back to 65 million years ago when the dinosaurs became extinct, all the way back to 245 million years ago. And there's our representation. That's the Jurassic, Triassic, Cretaceous world of the dinosaurs. So when we think about dinosaurs, we're thinking about the Mesozoic time frame. Then there's another extinct fossil, which everybody finds curious, the trilobite. And the trilobite began with the Cambrian explosion some 550 million years ago, all the way up to 245 million years ago, actually 520 to 245 according to the fossil records. And it represents most of the Paleozoic. And so these are kind of just some spots on the geologic time scale to give us an idea of where other fossils will fall. So let's start. Let's start with the sand dollar. Everybody likes to collect sand dollars on the beach. The sand dollar actually looks like this. You just find a skeleton on the beach, but it's actually this fuzzy little thing. It's kind of cute. Love to have one of those, but obviously couldn't live outside the water, so not a good idea. But the sand dollar the kids can collect on the beach. We see them such as this. Now here's an interesting picture. Here's what it looks like when impacted in rock as a fossil. This is a true fossil. The question is, has it really changed over time? No, not according to these these pictures and the sand dollar we saw just a moment ago, the shell. But the question becomes is, what do they, scientists, geologists, indicate the age of this fossil to be? This one's 20 million years old. 20 million years old. So what they're saying is after 20 million years, the sand dollar has not changed. Sand dollar has not changed. Now you'd think to yourself, 20 million years, that's quite a bit of time. That ought to be sufficient time to see some evolution occurring. And certainly there have been changes in the conditions of the ocean through that 20 million years. There's been heating cycles, there's been cooling cycles, there's been rise of sea level, there's been fall of sea level. You have all kinds of things changing, even the chemical composition of the ocean. And so you saw no real impact of that, and the sand dollar must just be a really robust species that doesn't alter a whole lot. So interesting. 20 million years, no change. All right, we'll give them that. How about the bat? The bat's kind of a unique mammal. Obviously, we like invertebrates or flying rodent. Kind of scary little thing when you're in the caves, but really not that scary whenever you meet one firsthand, unless you're meeting it in the dark. The bat, though, is unique, though. It certainly stands out and has a unique bone structure. So when we find it in the fossil record, such as this one right here, it's easily identified as a bat. You can't mistake it as anything else. But here's the deal. That one hasn't changed in 50 million years. It's found in a rock dated back to 50 million years. How is it that it's not evolved in 50 million years? All right. You see where I'm going with this? So now let's speed it up a little bit. How about the horse? 15 million years old is this particular fossil of a horse. Notice also it's buried, it's deposited with fish. Last I checked, fish and horses don't live together. Of course, the question is well, supposedly, according to the finding here, this horse died, fell into a pond or a river or something like that, and of course then fish were deposited also. But what we also learned today as we were talking, how long does it take for a fossil to form? Well, actually most fossils to be preserved have to be buried rapidly. And so in this case, this horse washed into an environment with fish, and they were all buried together in the same layer. So it's a catastrophic event. It has to be. But that horse, is what we're reminded of, hasn't changed in 50 million years. How about a turtle? I know this picture is not really good, but actually these look very similar. In fact, you can see the long tail on that turtle. Not all turtles have a long tail, but this fossil does, and so does that living one today. But you can see also, and it's hard to see in here, the same pattern that's on the shells actually match as well. Well, that turtle is 50 million years old. Now how about the dragonfly and the bumblebee? Now these would be really hard to preserve. If these things die, like running into the front of your windshield, and then they ultimately fall on the ground, a bird or something is going to eat it. An insect may carry it off, whatever the case is, it may even break down microbially. So what do you do to get one of these preserved? It has to be buried rapidly. It has to be buried rapidly or else it's going to decay. If it doesn't turn into a fossil very quickly, then the wing structures, which are very fragile, if it doesn't fossilize rapidly, and it actually takes a long time, they will not be preserved either. But yet, we can find fossils with the preservation not only of their bodies and their heads, even their appendages and their wings. How old are they? Well, they're 70 million years old. 70 million years old. These two insects are in the same rock units you find dinosaurs. Because the dinosaurs went extinct at 65 million. Are you telling me that these insects, these very fragile, very unique creatures, lived through the great period at which the dinosaurs went extinct? Whether it be a comet strike, whether it be some kind of volcanism with some kind of sulfuric gas pouring into the atmosphere, whatever the case was. The evolutionists are saying they survived and in fact never changed from that time forward. They're still exactly the same. I find that extremely hard to believe. How about frogs, amphibians? Amphibians of this particular frog, 70 million years old. Again, it made it through the great extinction of the Cretaceous. How about clams? These are back to the ocean, so we moved off of shore, off of the land, back into the ocean. Clams have been around, bivalve mollusks have been around for a long time. These, 80 million years old. How about the needlefish, a chordata species? The needlefish is very unique. It's got a very elongated snout. It's got teeth. It's got fins in very unique places along its body. Almost looks eel-like, but it truly is a fish. This very unique species is very limited in the world today, but when it's found as a fossil, it definitely ties back to a species that hasn't changed. How old? 100 million years old. 100 million years, and that unique species of fish has never changed. How about the tree shrew, the oldest mammal known today, also known as Meatherium. Meatherium actually ran around below the feet of the dinosaurs at 125 million years ago. Still looks like a tree shrew today. The narrow claw crawfish, very unique animal. You can see by its pincers, based on its antennae, based on its feathered looking tail, based on the count of appendages, all of those things. Very similar. No real major change. 150 million years old, going back to the Jurassic. The squatina, or the angel shark, part of the chordata family, ultimately is a very unique looking shark because it has this kind of almost a stealth looking body to it, and it has two unique sets of fins, or kind of the feathery looking extensions off to the sides, but also has the extremely elongated tail with fins along it. So again, it's very unique. It's very unique. It's not like we see other things that are modified off it. It's kind of separated by itself. This one, again, 150 million years old, and nothing is altered through all of this period. How about the coelacanth? The coelacanth is a very interesting fish. It stands out. It's got its own jaw, teeth. It's a very kind of nasty looking fish, but it's actually pretty slow. You can see divers there in the picture with a live one today. There you see over there on the left a fossil of it, 155 million years old. Now here's a backstory on coelacanth. Coelacanth was taught mistakenly by evolutionists to be the animal that transitioned on the land, became the first tetrapod, became the first four-legged thing to walk up on the shoreline, and was taught in biology classes for a very long time. Here's the problem. Coelacanth disappeared from the fossil record with the last of the dinosaurs. That was supposedly 65 million years ago. In the early 1900s, evolutionists touted it as the first walking fish, the transition between fish and tetrapods. That is until 1938, when one was found alive and unable to walk. It's a problem. And so what do? They change the story. As I've said before, and I'll say it again, the great thing about the evolutionary story is it's always evolving. They like to change the story because they don't always have all the facts. That's why it's still a theory and not a standard of fact. And it's still based on faith today. And sometimes their faith fails. Salamander, here's a particular example. 160 million years ago, Jurassic, looks just like the modern. Here's a gavial. It's a reptile. It's kind of like a crocodile alligator, but it's unique because of its very narrow beak, its elongated snout nose, but it is a unique looking species, and it stands out. The problem is its ancestors go back to 160 million years and still look alike. What do the textbooks say? The order, Crocodilia, consists of 23 species of crocodiles, alligators, caimans, and the gavial. Crocodiles first appeared nearly 160 million years ago and have changed very little since. I can show you alligators and crocodiles, and guess what? Same problem as the gavial. They all look alike after 160 million years. And some of them, like the gavial, are very unique. How about the horseshoe crab? I learned about the horseshoe crab in paleontology, study of ancient life, saw numerous fossils of them, and then one day in South Carolina, while walking a beach doing some geologic work, I actually saw one crawling across the beach. I go, wait a minute, it's still alive. How old are the fossils? Well, the fossil here on the left is 160 million years. Now here's the kicker. The one on the right, it's hard to see, but the impression is definitely there. You see the rounded shell. You see the angled corners coming off. You can see also the tail section on the back, as well as its appendages that are broken up by joints there. It is unique, and it is identifiable. Here's the problem. It's 445 million years old. What does that mean? 445 million years ago says, just after the Cambrian explosion, this species showed up and never changed through the rest of time. That's a problem. As a geologist, I have a problem with that. And it works against evolution. It says it never evolved and couldn't evolve. It failed. So what happened? Well, one of two things had to happen. Either evolution failed, and we're seeing it failing in multiple species, or that time is not near as accurate as what they're proposing it to be. One more example. The brittle starfish. Here's a brittle star. Down here in the bottom right, alive and well. It is interesting. It's got kind of a ropey looking leg versus just regular starfish. And sometimes it has cilia along it. You can see one there at the top left with the same center, almost sand dollar kind of looking thing. Of course, they're both echinoderms, so they do have that shared in common. That one's 150 million years old. And the one down at the bottom left that's with the trilobites is 450 million years old. 450 million. Here's yet another species that didn't find a way to evolve since the explosion of life on Earth. One last one, I meant to include this one too. Starfish, same problem. Again, 40 million years old in that one case. Over here is 450 million years. Now, of all these examples, what are we trying to demonstrate? We demonstrated this. All around the evolutionary tree, species have failed in the geologic fossil record to evolve. And when I look at the facts, now look at the evidence, what do I as a geologist have to believe? There's a flaw in this theory, a serious flaw in this theory. To make the assumption that all of these things have been evolving from some common ancestor way back here at 450 million years ago, when some of them continue to survive afterwards, never changing or evolving, is a problem to me, and it should be a problem to you. And young people, when you're sitting in your evolutionary class and your teacher's teaching you about evolution, you need to ask them about some of these things and say, hey, why hasn't some of these things evolved? I mean, surely there was a chance for mutation. Surely there were changes in the niche of the environment. Certainly conditions on Earth were constantly changing. There was differences in competition for food sources. There was different competitions for space. Why didn't it ever evolve? Why didn't it ever evolve? Because evolution fails. Evolution fails. It failed to deliver on all these species, and yet there are many more that we could share. But the key is we've shown you the entire spectrum of its failure. So, when we go back and we look at our hypotheses we started out with tonight of evolution, and we put it to the test, what did we find? Well, we don't really know about geologic times. We haven't really covered it. It does have problems. The radiometric dating, as a geochemist, I can tell you, has its problems. I can tell you they cherry-picked the data. In fact, at times when I have submitted rock samples for radiometric dating, one of the things that puts out there is something you've got to list is which formation of rock did it come from. If you leave it blank, they'll send it back and not test it. Why? Because if you'll give them the formation, they can dial in the time. If you don't give them the formation, they're working with an open canvas and they don't know where to land. And they won't give you the data because it goes against the paradigm of evolution. It's a problem. So, even giving them geologic time, what did we find tonight? Well, yes, we saw random mutations. Yes, we see natural selection. But we never got to transitional forms. Even with all the testing of Drosophila over a century, no changes in species. Then, what did we notice? We saw, obviously, abiogenesis has never been proven. We even gave them that. But because there's no transitional forms, there's no biogenesis either. There's no new species and speciation occurring. And then, what do we have to conclude? Well, remember how all those little arrows worked up to evolution? If you don't get those things started and rolling in the right direction, you don't get there. You don't get there. And so how many assumptions has to go into evolution to make it work? You got to assume all the way up the ladder right to the end to get it to work. And the problem is, that's too many assumptions for me to put my faith in it. And I hope it's too many assumptions for you to put your faith in it. In fact, it's based on these premises that ultimately evolutionists admitted it to be a potential failure. Charles Darwin himself, in Origin of the Species in the Preface in 1859, said this: the number of intermediate varieties, or fossils, missing links, which have formerly existed on Earth must be truly enormous. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology surely does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be argued against my theory. What did Charles Darwin do? He set up a hypothesis for scientific testing against the scientific method, and it has failed. But you know what? Surely things have changed since 1859. Then we advance forward to 1980. Dr. Stephen Jay Gould, one of the biggest names in paleontology, said this. He said, the absence of fossil evidence for intermediary stages between major transitions in organic design, indeed our inability, even in our imagination, to construct functional intermediates, in many cases, missing links, has been a persistent and nagging problem for gradualistic accounts of evolution. And so what did Stephen Gould do? He proposed something called punctual equilibrium. Meaning, punctual, the period, bang, it happened. And we just don't have enough proof that it did, but you know what? We have faith enough to believe it did. It's kind of like back to the Big Bang, right? We have faith enough to believe that it got started, and we'll give it some fancy name, and it must have happened, because look at all the evidence afterwards. The facts don't add up. And they make their admissions, and they may make up even new and even more fanciful theories and hypotheses, but the bottom line is they don't have any proof. And without proof, it's just a faith. It's a belief in something. And I stand here today and tell you, I don't have enough faith to believe in this teaching with all I've learned over the years. And hopefully tonight, the evidence that works against evolution makes you take a step back whenever you're challenged in your Christian, Bible-based faith. The next time you're challenged in that situation and you're listening to your professor and go, that sure sounds convincing. It sure sounds like a lot of the research work has been done to prove this. I want you to step back and think about this and think to yourself, what's my alternative to a Bible-based faith? What's my alternative to a Christian-based faith? I'm going to have to believe in this. And unless you're going to go out and get a geology degree, paleontology degree, and a whole lot of biologic work underneath that, I don't know how you're going to go out and counter, because the best minds in the world haven't got there yet. So I hope, young people, you'll take the opportunity to think twice before abandoning your faith for something as pitiful as this. And I hope you'll take the time to share this kind of knowledge with others who are being influenced by it. Tonight, the lesson is yours. The question is evolution true or false? And I think tonight the evidence says it's got some real problems, real issues, and there are certainly other areas we could go and look at to see that. Genesis chapter 1, verses 20 through 31, just hitting some of the high points of it, paraphrasing most of it, says, let the waters abound with the abundance of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the face of the firmament of the heavens. Let the earth bring forth the living creature according to its kind, cattle and creeping thing and beasts of the earth, each according to its kind. Let us make man in our image according to our likeness, not according to the likeness of animals. That God saw everything that he had made, and indeed, it was very good. It's very good. When people attack the creation account, they're attacking that which is good. And they're trying to supplant it with something that's evil, that says man isn't like God, nor will ever be, and instead is just simply like an animal. And then leads to, obviously, societal breakdowns, where we act like animals. When we literally leave the natural use of the body, as Paul says in the Roman letter, and where we have, obviously, the rise of homosexuality today, confusion about even which gender you might be, confusion about a number of things about where you come from and what choices you should make, what rules should govern you, who you should answer to, if to anybody. And so when you have these societal breakdowns, it leads to all kinds of poor choices. And we've got to be very cautious of what it does to even our society. But at the end of the day, I want to remind you of John chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. John there says this, and very beautifully. He says, in the beginning was the Word. And we find out later the Word was Jesus Christ. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. Jesus is co-creator. And for those who try to balance evolution with Christianity and with a biblical interpretation, which many do today, because they can't work through that conflict, they don't realize what they're really doing. What they're really doing is attacking creation. Because it's an attack on Christ. We need to be very cautious of that. If we don't have enough faith to believe that Jesus helped in the creation account of the book of Genesis, such as John proposes, then why are we claiming him? Because in the end, we're actually attacking him and attacking his ability, attacking who he is. And so we need to be very cautious we don't enter into that dark and very dreadful place of trying to balance humanistic thought